Welcome, everyone, to this legal office hours. Today's topic, the do's and don'ts of the LOI. My name is Will Smith. I'm the host of the podcast Acquiring Minds and a partner in Minds Capital, a fund that invests in independent sponsor-led acquisitions. Attorneys James David Williams and Bill Barlow are going to host this session. Bill and James David are partners in Barlow and Williams, a practice that specializes in small business M&A. They're at the front lines of our market. Their focus is helping searchers and sponsors like you get your deals done. They also represent sellers, so they see both sides of the table in our world. The way we run these, as always, is that Bill and James David have brought a presentation that they will give, and then we'll do Q&A. To ask a question, use the Q&A button of Zoom. If you have a very in-the-weeds question, ask it. We may not get to it because those can be a little bit hard for broad audience consumption, but James David will see it and get back to you later with a personalized response. We are recording the session, so we will send out a link to that recording in the next day or two. And then also, as mentioned in the marketing, the LOI template of Barlow and Williams will be shared probably by Bill and James David tomorrow or the next day, not by the email you get from Acquiring Minds. Anyway, just watch your inboxes for links to the video and to the LOI. They'll come one way or another soon. And lastly, links in the chat to Barlow and Williams' website, to James David and Bill's LinkedIn's. Connect with them there. Guys, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Will. Another thing, just housekeeping. If you have a question that is specific, make sure you do include your email. If you're using the anonymous function, I should say, make sure you also say who you are. Otherwise, we won't be able to respond. So the general point of today is talking about the do's and don'ts of the LOI. We're also going to cover at the end a little bit of some good tips and tricks for people who are starting their search. And so if you are at the beginning of your search and you're doing this is fantastic. Even if you're in the middle of it, this will be a good refresher. So let's jump right in. All right, so first, let's talk for a second about what is the LOI. So the LOI stands for Letter of Intent. So it is a document that is signed by somebody who is proposing to buy a business, and it is, if it's accepted, it's signed by the seller of the business. Now, in general, it's non-binding, meaning that just because you sign an LOI doesn't mean you're legally obligated to then buy the business on the terms of the LOI. So what this allows you to do, you might think, well, why am I signing this document if it doesn't really mean that, I'm going to do the deal? What it does is it really helps solidify and make sure that you and the seller are on the same page. The seller is going to sell to you and no one else, and the main terms of what that sale is going to be if all the due diligence and everything like that checks out. So the main points of an LOI, you want to have all the main terms of a transaction. After you sign an LOI, you're going to go and incur a lot of costs for legal due diligence, financial due diligence, all those sort of things. You don't want to pay that money unless you know that at the end of it, you're going to have a deal with the seller. So you have to have all the main terms of the transaction so that you know that you're on the same page. It also, people may talk about retrading. One of the questions we get asked is like, okay, well, I signed an LOI for, to buy a business for $5 million. Do I have to consummate it? Can I retrade later on? And the answer is, if all the information that is provided by the seller matches up with what they said at the beginning of the process, you need to be prepared to go through with the transaction on the terms you laid out in the LOI. Now, if it turns out that the seller represented, they have 1.5 million in EBITDA and they actually have 1.2 million EBITDA, there are retrades that happen. But that's after you discover it. If everything checks out, you should be prepared to do the transaction on the terms of the LOI. And it should be simple enough to avoid confusion. You are dealing with sellers of small businesses. They are really good at their small business, but they often have not gone through this process before. So if you create a bunch of complicated mechanics with earnouts and other things, just make sure it's clear enough so that both sides know exactly what's going on. Because if it turns out that the seller thought that you were saying A and you actually meant B, then you might not have a deal and that might blow everything up. And then you paid a bunch of money and you couldn't do anything with it.
Yeah, I'll just add, right, for purposes of the LOI, right, you have to assume that the information that's given to you in the business listing, in the SIM, and whatever financials have been provided, right, you assume that that information is true when you draft the LOI, because there's nothing else to do about it. And even though there are very few legally binding terms, there are definitely psychologically binding terms, especially if you're dealing with kind of founder sellers. Um, Psychological anchoring to things in the LOI, especially around price. That's a real thing. So as we kind of go through the sections of the document, right, one of the big things is, what type of transaction are you proposing? Right? Are you proposing an asset purchase? Are you proposing a stock purchase? Are you proposing an equity purchase of some kind that would give you tax treatment as if it were an asset purchase, right? Something like an F reorganization or certain other tax elections. You want to be very clear as to which you are doing, right? Because the tax consequences, both for you and the seller, are different or can be different in different structures. I've seen several LOIs where people put both constructs together, and I don't know if they're offering to buy the assets or the stock. If I don't know, then the seller definitely doesn't know. And that's, refer back to the previous slide, we want to avoid confusion.
One thing I'll also just say here is that when the seller is a C corporation, it's often kind of the worst circumstance because you often want to buy the assets, and that's really bad for the seller. You will sometimes hear brokers say things like, "Oh, you can make a 338H10 election to just buy it." That almost never works. If the seller is a C corporation, know that it's going to be difficult. And if a broker just kind of tells you not to worry about it, the truth is the broker probably just read something online and doesn't actually know what happens when you try and do so is the thing. So I'll just point that as a little flag to keep in mind if you come across a target that's a C corporation. All right. So in terms of the most important parts of an LOI, probably the thing that they're going to look at first and most importantly is the purchase price. So you should state very clearly the purchase price of the business is insert dollar amount so that they can see that. And then you will write underneath it, you're going to list out what how that breaks down because giving somebody $100 is great, but if it's $10 at closing and $90 10 years from now, well, that's not the same deal as $90 today and $10 10 years from now. Those terms really matter. So you'll typically have the purchase price is whatever the amount is, and then you'll break it out into constituent parts, which is usually the amount of cash at close and the amount of cash in a seller note. Sometimes you have holdbacks. If you're doing a larger deal, you have holdbacks for indemnification or for net working capital. And then you also have earnouts. Now, if you're financing your deal with the SBA, earnouts basically don't work. You have to do a forgivable seller note. But if you're not doing SBA, then you can also include an earnout component. Another thing you should just make clear is what is included. Where we see people mess up with this is like, is the real estate included or is it not? Right? Because that's a big change. Another place we see is the inventory. Is that included or not? We've had deals where the inventory is basically the same size as the business. And so whether or not the purchase price is including that is basically it's a very important factor. So if you're including inventory, you need to say this, includes all the inventory. Um, and then sometimes as well, you might have, working capital issues, which I think we're going to talk about in the next slide.
Yeah, a couple more SBA notes, just from having reviewed a lot of searcher prepared LOIs. If you are using SBA financing and the seller note is going to be contingent in any way, right? List those contingencies, make those contingencies clear early. If you don't, it becomes very difficult to add them later. And also, as you break down the purchase price, you don't have to spell out how much is searcher equity and how much is coming from the bank. Just lump it together as cash at close into a single line.
Yeah. I'll give you two more tricks on that. The first is if you are doing some type of either earnout or seller forgivable note, then I would lean towards doing revenue or maybe gross profit. EBITDA will very often result in fights. I'm not saying you can't do it. We've done it multiple times, but just know that if you're using EBITDA as a metric, it's potentially going to be more litigious later on. The other thing I'll note is that if you are using SBA financing and you want to do a forgivable seller note, so that would be something like, I'll give you, $100 on this note, but it gets forgiven if your revenue drops. The forgivable seller note has to be based on past financial metrics. So, like the continuation of revenue is a good example. Sometimes people come to us and they say, I want this seller note to be forgiven if a major customer walks away. And you can't directly do that within the SBA construct. You can do something where you kind of back out, well, how much revenue would drop if that happened, and then you create a forgivable seller note around that. But you can't just have a simple, this, key employee leaves, I get money, or customer leaves, I get money. It's a little bit more constrained on what you can do.
Next item, and this is sort of in our template, as you'll see in a couple of days, this goes right below the purchase price. But don't just put the number, right? If you just put a number, then the seller is going to anchor to that number, right? You want to be able to have the conversation later if you need around, retrade or adjustment in purchase price or whatever we want to call it. That conversation becomes a lot easier if you state, right, the purchase price is X, which is Y multiple of Z metric, and fill in those numbers with whatever they are. That way, if the QOE report says, all right, the revenues were actually 20% less, or SDE, or EBITDA, whatever metric you're using. Well, okay, seller, then my purchase price is now going to drop because I told you I was paying this multiple, right? And you signed up for that, right? It just makes it an easier conversation. I did not say easy conversation. It is never an easy conversation. I said easier. But if you don't, then, if you don't have this hook, it's just, it makes it more difficult because the seller will just say, well, you agreed to pay X.
Yeah. Working capital, this is one thing we often see either not addressed or addressed poorly. So your default should say that the purchase price assumes the normalized level of net working capital. You Working capital is things like accounts receivable. You want to make sure that when you buy the business is going to have cash coming in as invoices are paid. Um, and this allows you to continue to run the business. Sometimes sellers will say, I'm not giving you accounts receivable. And the problem is that if you accept that, then you're not going to, let's say you have a business that invoices on net 60, right? Then the first 60 days, you're still having to pay salary, you're having to pay, whatever inventory you have, all those expenses you're paying, and all the money that's coming in from all those past invoices is going to the seller. So, you do some work the day after closing, you send an invoice, that invoice might not be paid for 60 days, right? And so you generally want to say, look, I'm assuming that I'm buying this company with a normal level of working capital. Another thing that is common is sometimes they want to tell you, like, hey, I want you to say the working capital is $100,000, or, put in a definite number, or the inventory is $200,000. The problem is that you don't know what the right number is, right? The seller is saying that's the right number, but you don't know until you've actually done your financial due diligence. So don't commit to a specific number until you go in and do your due diligence. Now you can tell the seller, like, hey, this is how I'm thinking about it. We're going to take the last 12 months and find the average, or we're going to look at the last 3 months expenses, and that'll be the number. You can give them a sense of how you're thinking about it, but don't commit to solid numbers. The other thing that is sometimes an issue is some types of businesses have works in progress where they might be paid for by a client for some, like, a large project that's going to take 3 months, or sometimes even in manufacturing you might have an order and there's a lot of value add components that go into it before it gets shipped. So the question is, well, what happens if you're 20% of the way through and you've been paid 10% of the total money, or you've been paid 30% of the total money? How does that all work? If that's the type of business you're buying, you want to address that in the LOI, just so that there aren't any surprises. Oftentimes, you basically look at the percentage complete and do remittances based on that.
Yeah, pretty common in construction too. Uh, but here, working capital is one of the areas where brokers can be the pushiest, um, because a lot of times brokers will just say, "I'll get the working capital from the bank. Just get it from the lender." Right? And that's an option sometimes, not always, sometimes. But if you do that, just understand you're effectively increasing your purchase price, right? Because you need that working capital. So if you have to put cash on the balance sheet in order to run the business, then your purchase price goes up. As far as numbers go, right, working capital is one of those areas where the seller may not have any idea what their working capital needs actually are. Um, and if they do, then you certainly don't, right? So you're dealing with a huge informational asymmetry, which is why we don't like it when people commit to numbers. Next thing is around transition services, which is sort of, what this means is what is the seller going to do? What work is the seller going to do for you post closing? And if we're in the SBA realm, then this is limited to, and it's a total buyout in SBAs, and it can only be 12 months or less, and they have to be a contractor, not an employee. If we're outside of those restrictions, then there could be an employment agreement here or what have you. But you kind of want to not necessarily get to numbers. Sometimes people can, but you want to try to outline expectations in the LOI. And the big thing, actually, maybe even more important than getting to numbers, is are you going to be paying the seller additional money or not for transition services, right? There could be a world where a certain amount of transition services are included in the purchase price, right? There's also a world where they're not, and you're paying extra over top of the purchase price for transition or consulting services or employment agreement. If it's an employment agreement, you got to pay them. But uh, and there's different frameworks for transition services. But if it is true transition and they're not going to be like an employee or an owner post closing, then you want to also make sure, and this doesn't go in the LOI, but I'll note it anyway, but you want to make sure as the buyer that you can tell the seller that time's up and it's time to go to the beach if you need to. You don't want the seller sticking around if you're ready for them to be going.
Another thing I'll just mention here, we commonly see if businesses require a certain license that is held by the seller, we see LOI sent out where the seller is agreeing to be an employee and license the business. And that works only if you're not in the SBA land. If you are using SBA, then the seller, assuming it's a full buyout, which it almost always is, the seller is not allowed to be an employee, which almost always means that his license can't be used for the business. So just keep that in mind. If you are buying the business of a seller and the seller is the license holder, don't expect that you can use the seller's license. It has to be the license of another employee, or you have to get the license or already have it.
And health insurance gets complicated because they can't be employees and have to be contractors. So
Yeah. They'll often ask for like basically reimbursements for their health insurance. The next thing is the non-compete. You know, luckily, most of the time you're dealing with a seller that is sick of their job and therefore is not going to push back too hard on this. But you should make it clear that they will be expected to sign a non-compete and a non-solicit. I'll quickly say a non-solicit is saying things like, you can't go after my customers. You can't solicit the customers of the company. You can't solicit the employees of the company. Non-compete also says, even if you don't solicit the customers, you can't create a similar sized business, similar kind of business. So, like if you're doing, pool construction, you can't, start a new pool construction in the company, but just say, oh, I'm not using your same customers. No, we just want you out of, whatever business it is that you're doing. It's good to define years. So 5 years is pretty standard. In APAs, and also scope and geography. So, a lot of times if it's geographically constrained and they have to be on site, you'll have a geographic constraint, anywhere in a certain state or within 100 miles or 150 miles. Be generous because you want it to be as expansive as possible. It's actually pretty common that if you have a business that's selling to customers all over the United States, you might say all over the United States or anywhere in the world even. But you just want to make sure that this is clear up front, so you have it.
okay, exclusivity. So this, we talked about a lot of the terms in the LOI being non-binding from a legal perspective, but in a well-written LOI, this one is binding, right? This is one of the few provisions that is binding. Now, not the easiest thing to actually enforce if it came to it, but in theory, you could enforce this with litigation. And we've seen that at least be threatened in certain circumstances. But anyway, you want to state a period of time during which the seller can't speak to other buyers. That's not to say that the brokerage won't leave the listing up, right? You'll if you go browse a lot of broker sites, you'll see listings that say under contract, right, or something similar. That means that they are under LOI, but buyers can still reach out to the broker about those acquisitions. But the broker really shouldn't be passing those offers along to the seller, right? And the seller can't be communicating with those people. The exclusivity timeline is something that can be one of the most heavily negotiated parts of an LOI. And it can be as simple as, okay, it's 90 days from signing or 60 days, or I don't really go shorter than 60 days, but sometimes they'll say 30. I've seen the shortest I think I've ever seen in one was 7. I don't know why they even bothered. But there can also be staging of exclusivity of, you've got this amount of time to apply for financing. You've got this amount of time to have a commitment letter. You've got this amount of time to, there's different milestones that could be used for this. But as a standard, just sort of it's X number of days or months. And we often encourage people like include mechanisms to extend exclusivity, right? If exclusivity is about to run out, you can create an amendment to the LOI. It's a one-page sort of thing where the exclusivity date was X, we're changing it to Y. Buyer sign, seller sign, A-OK. But it's easier if you don't have to do that and gives you, as the buyer, a little more leverage.
Now for a few things you shouldn't do. And these are based on a lot of real world experience. So let's just get right into it. So it's very common. I literally saw an LOI this morning that I reviewed where a broker asked for a large deposit. Um, this is not real estate. And a lot of the brokers that ask for this are brokers that are more familiar with the real estate construct. The reason why earnest money deposits are not appropriate for an M&A transaction is because in over half of M&A transactions at this lower market, something comes up in due diligence, oftentimes a problem with the financials of the seller, and you can't move forward with the deal as a result of that. Now you have your, large deposit that is being held captive, and the seller is probably angry at with you because they went through all this work and, you said their business wasn't worth what originally thought it was. And now you're in a really difficult position because you've got an angry seller and your money is being held hostage. So if the broker is concerned, then you can say, look, I've got this commitment letter from a bank. It's you can demonstrate that you have the financial means, or I should say, like pre-approval letter. You have the means to fund this acquisition. You can demonstrate that without doing earnest money deposits. We've seen them agree to in very rare circumstances when the only times we do is when the seller really feels that it's necessary. And then we have a lot of outs. Like basically, if I don't like this transaction for any reason, I get my money back. And that's the only sort of thing that we'll ever advise our clients to agree to. But that you should resist it at all costs.
And I have even stronger thoughts than Bill expressed, so we may get to those later. Broker provided forms. This was actually in the same thing Bill just referenced that we reviewed this morning because I looked at it too. This one was a particular form from, I think, California Business Broker Association or whatever, but which is not one of the worst ones, but still one I don't advise. But in any event, draft your own LOI. Right? I don't care what the broker says, right? The broker wants to use, there are brokers who say, use this form, right? Use this form. Don't do that. Use your own. And the reason, right, there are a few reasons. Right, one is that any broker provided form is going to be heavily tilted to the seller. And that puts you on the back foot the whole way. It's going to have you committing to things you shouldn't be committing to. It's going to have you commit to a timeline that's unreasonable. They almost always have deposits. Even more than that, some of them are actually purchase agreements. There are a few brokerages that I won't name publicly, but that are on a blacklist where we don't even, if we see an offer, see an LOI or see a listing from one of those brokerages, we don't even talk to the prospective client because we know what it's going to be. Don't sign something without an attorney, but especially don't sign something provided by a brokerage because sometimes there are, and the way they will frame it with these purchase agreements, they say, oh, you can add contingencies, right? You can still, you can add contingencies. And that is a woefully insufficient remedy because you're stuck with all of their one-sided terms. and you've only got probably, a very short amount of time to pull the plug, or you're on the hook for potentially a multi-million-dollar acquisition. So uh, that's my thoughts about that.
Yeah. And now we have some questions. They're not necessarily all related to the LOI, but they are kind of related to the beginning of the search process. So we get these questions all the time, and we just want to run through them. Should you set up a legal entity before sending LOIs? It doesn't hurt. It never hurts. You can set up a simple LLC in whatever state you're in, and that usually is perfectly fine. Do you have to do it? No. We've seen people send it out in their personal capacity and then say, I'll set up an entity to buy this. It's not a requirement. What should I do if I'm asked to sign an NDA? In general, you'll be signing lots of NDAs, and it's usually just not worth it to engage attorneys to review each one for you. Usually you're fine. I would say that the things that you should be careful about, two things. Number one, we have seen on one occasion an NDA, which basically required you to pay a success fee of 1% to the company that provided the NDA. That was egregious. So, don't sign anything that requires any sort of payments. You should not be paying to see any NDAs. And then another thing is that if you actually are buying a business in the same industry, sometimes NDAs can have information about non-compete and other stuff that's not great. This won't apply to 5% of the people on this call, but if you are actually an existing business owner, you have to be a little bit more careful with the NDAs. When should I talk to a lawyer? This is an excellent question. And it's one that we ourselves sort of struggle with because on the one hand, we would love to talk to people all the time. We'd love each new searcher to have like a 30-minute call with them. But in practice, when we tried to do that, our day just got filled with a lot of calls, from people at the beginning of their search. That's not to say you shouldn't do that. It's fine to reach out, but a lot of attorneys who do this all the time, they can't necessarily get onto long conversations at the beginning of the process. And if you engage somebody, it can get expensive. If you want them to review every NDA or review every LOI and they're charging you hourly, it can rack up. So I would say the general good rule of thumb is you can always reach out at the beginning of your process. Like if you have some specific questions for us, you can reach out online or in the chat here, and we're happy to answer them. Usually, you don't really need to engage a lawyer until you've gotten to the point where you've sent across an LOI and then you've gotten a response, and then there's some, back and forth. That's a perfect time to engage a lawyer. Another time you might want to think about talking to a lawyer is the first time you're sending out an LOI. And usually you don't formally engage a lawyer, but you might reach out to us and say, hey, I'm sending out this LOI and I have this specific concern. Do you have a thought about this or something like this? That's sometimes appropriate too. Now, you don't want to be doing that every time you send out an LOI because then the lawyers will charge you and it'll get expensive, but it's okay if it's your first time and you're feeling a little nervous. The final thing, how do I draft my LOI? Please, please, please use a template. We're giving away our template for free because we think it works really well and answers a lot of questions. If you use a template, I encourage you to use our template or a template from another vetted, attorneys that are in the day-to-day in this. If you just use ChatGPT to do it, it sometimes just misses things, or other AI tools, I should say. It just sometimes misses things. And so there's no, it might be fine, it might not be fine, but the forms are free, the templates are free. So why not just use it? So that's what I would say is probably the best approach.
I think we'll let that be. So I'll wrap up before we do questions. Just a little bit about us because we didn't do this at the top. All right, we're Barlow and Williams. We are the firm. You work with us, you work with us. All we do is M&A, buy side, sell side, from searcher, sponsor, whatever. We always work on flat fees for our projects, and we use milestone-based payments that sort of are meant to align incentives and structure structure our engagement in the way these deals actually work. Uh, and the exact scope of those milestones, is going to be tailored to each individual acquisitions. We give quotes based on a deal by deal basis. So no absolutes there, but there are sort of formulas. Yeah, if you have questions through the process, I'm sure use the Q&A function, but or you can also be contacted. Uh, and then, if you are early in your search, right, still feel free to reach out, even if you are early. Because even if we don't necessarily meet with you, we'll at least, there's template resources, right? We gotta have template emails with resources to go out to people. So uh, don't hesitate. And also for those of you who are just starting your search, right, the LOI is one of those places where people get hung up and they overthink it and they overthink it and they overthink it. Um, don't let that happen to you. You're gonna probably have to send more than one LOI. So, you know, especially if it's a brokered process, just send it. Right? Draft an offer that you believe in and send it. Right? And what will be, but send it. Right? Get the reps in. Because if you don't ever send one, then you're never going to move forward in the process. So I've talked to multiple people who spent weeks or even months trying to draft the first LOI. Don't do that. Just send it.
All right. Well, that concludes our presentation. And now on to the fun Q&A.
Great, great presentation as always, guys. This is one that you've done before twice over the last 2 years, that is, and every time I get value from it. So really good stuff. Audience, just put back into the chat again links to Barlow and Williams' website and James David and Bill's LinkedIn's and email addresses. So just click those, connect with them on LinkedIn, and their email addresses, easy for you to get. Okay, lots of questions about the recording. Yes, everyone, you'll get the recording of this presentation by email probably this afternoon, maybe not until tomorrow. And then the template, lots of interest in that, as always. The template will come probably tomorrow, maybe the next day from Barlow and Williams directly. Go ahead.
The template, yeah. So the template got a few updates. I've been updating it in the last couple of weeks. So we've updated it. We've tweaked a couple of things. I added a couple more footnotes. We do use footnotes for our template, and there's 2 different color highlights. So get ready, because that's how I do documents. I use 3 different colors of highlighting. So there you go. But the reason it's not going out today is that I've not made videos yet. So what I will be doing kind of today, tomorrow, probably tomorrow, will be to find a few listings, find a few public listings, and we'll kind of annotate as I use my own template to create an LOI under different deal structures. So I did a few of those videos last year. They went over pretty well. I'll be doing a few more this year. And then, they'll end up on our website, but we'll have a link to that in the cover page of the template. And so that's why the template won't go out till probably tomorrow.
Great. So everybody just keep your eyes on your inboxes for a couple of emails, one from us, one from Bill and James David. And between those 2, you'll have everything. Okay. I don't think did you guys mention IOIs in this presentation? A couple questions about IOIs. So maybe just riff on them rather than me asking you the specific questions.
Yeah, so IOIs, that's called indication of intent, and those are letters that come before a letter of intent. This is something you'll see more often in larger deals. And the point is that you want to make sure you're at least kind of in the same ballpark before you start engaging counsel and other people that, start racking up a little bit more in the ways of expenses. Now, on smaller deals, look, if your broker wants you to send an IOI before sending an LOI, fine. Kind of do what the broker wants. It's even less binding than an LOI. But most of the time, you don't really need to go through the multi-step process in these smaller deals. you just kind of jump straight to the LOI.
Yeah, the IOIs are used by investment bankers to kind of get to semifinalists and finalist stages, right? They stage diligence and kind of, drip access to a data room, right? And if you're in that world, right, okay, play in that world. If you're if you're below that, where an IOI can make sense is in an off-market deal where you are the first person talking to this seller. In that circumstance, it might make sense pretty early, build the relationship. But once you have the relationship built a little bit, right, just share a one page, right? Here's the sort of range, right? Here's the range I'm thinking. Because if it turns out that your range and his number are wildly off, then it's much better that you find that out early. And that's not to say that your range may be accurate. His number may be delusional. And, sometimes that can come back around 6 months, 12 months later after he's been, informed by the market that his business is actually not worth what he thought it was. Right. So, commit to real numbers. But sometimes the IOI can make sense for off-market deals to save everybody time and expense.
And to be clear, what that looks like is kind of the best practice. Arguably, it could be the body of an email itself, but kind of the more professional approach would be a very quick email. Attached is my IOI, my indication of interest, and the IOI is just a one pager. It's just a one pager, almost like a paragraph saying, "This is the ballpark that I would express, that I would." Better language than that, but this is what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
it's really sniffing it out to see if you're in the same ballpark. It's an exercise in, are we in the same ballpark?
Yeah.
Right.
This sort of range, this sort of multiple range, and this sort of deal structure. And it really doesn't go beyond that.
So as light as that sounds, James David, I bet there are people who are like, yeah, but do you have a template for that?
And no, I don't. I don't have a template for that.
It's a really light thing, everybody. Probably the best practice there is just be a separate, just one pager, but Google for a template there.
If you're working,
don't need to overthink it.
Yeah, but if you're dealing with a Main Street business broker, it's not going to be part of the process.
Yeah. Usually, almost always.
Okay. Going back to the conversations about these, the earnest money fees, a couple people have encountered requests for that in their searches. So I'll just pick one in particular. Kristen says, I was also asked to do an APA and an earnest money deposit. I've spoken with others who've experienced this. While you guys say it's a don't on the don't list, it does feel common. So regardless, so what's the best way to seem like a strong buyer, but not do it, not play ball when asked for an earnest deposit?
I think what you say, and it does depend on the broker, you're almost always dealing with an inexperienced broker. And, you really want to present yourself as their solution, right? I mean, look, if they find a sucker that's willing to do it and do it on those terms, then of course they're going to pick the sucker, right? But you would say, look, I really like this company. I think I'd be a really good fit. If you've met the seller, you can express how much you enjoy the seller, talking with the seller. And then you say, but, this is a very substantial commitment for me. And it's not appropriate. I want to run the process the way that it is usually run. And for deals of this size, you have letters of intent and you don't do money deposits because of sometimes you educate the broker because we need to do our financial diligence. You can also say, by the way, this sometimes works. You can say, look, you want to know I'm committed. I'm spending QOE. I'm getting legal. You talk about all the expenses you're incurring. I'm like not working at my job just so that I can fly down and meet this person. You show them the commitment. I have, this letter from a lender saying that they'll lend to me up to X amount. Like I'm in it and I'm spending real money. Why doesn't the seller give a deposit to me to help me incur all of my expenses? We actually saw one time where the seller had just gone through a process and gotten burned. And we actually negotiated to have both the seller and the buyer put in $50,000 in a deposit. And the idea is that, well, we have costs that we're incurring too. So where's our deposit? Probably we have more costs as the buyer than you do as the seller. So in that case, the seller was very skittish because they just gotten burned by a PE company that left them at the altar after 6 months of negotiation. Sometimes you have to be flexible. But in that case, we also made it very clear and easy that people could kind of walk away. So
Yeah, I'm not gonna say that everybody's a sucker who signs up for earnest money,
there.
because that's not fair. Um, but the same broker who's going to demand earnest money is not right. If you were to say, okay, I want to put in a break fee for the seller, um, they're not going to be interested in that. So, again, it is often just an unfortunate part of dealing with real estate brokers, um, which, for better or worse, right, you have to have a real estate license to be a broker in certain states that have a lot of businesses, right? And so that uh, leads to some of these dynamics. If there is an earnest money deposit, right, what often, right, if there is one, there are two things that matter, right? One is who holds the money, and two is what are the conditions around the release of that money, right? And I don't really want to go into tremendous detail about that, but obviously it's easier for you to get that money back if it's sitting in, one of our trust accounts versus it sitting in the broker's account, right? And if there's clear language that, you can withdraw from the transaction and get your earnest, get your money back for, more or less any reason, then one, I don't see the point of it anyway. But the whole mechanism is just added cost, frankly. That's what a lot of it, right? There's additional cost for this too, right? Because you do have to set up escrow and all of that. And it ends up just being annoying and making things more cumbersome. Um, but if it is in play, then the conditions become very important, because I have seen litigation threatened over these, and they can be enough money to make it where litigation would happen over these. So
Yeah. And just because something is common doesn't mean it's something you should agree to. You will see a lot of requests for this, but that doesn't mean that, you know, don't be pressured into that.
Thank you. What about the idea of including language where the seller will pay for the Q of E and other diligence costs if the deal breaks?
Yeah.
Idea being that the Q of E that you've done, they actually have is valuable to them. So they would get the Q of E and maybe compensate for you for something that they then get future value out of.
yeah, I mean that barely passes the laugh test, to even say it. So the seller break fee, um, your LOI will get rejected if you're in a competitive process. Just full stop. I see it sometimes. Sometimes we see it where people will have a fee if which is really just a liquidated damages clause, if the seller breaches the exclusivity provision. Sometimes there will be a dollar amount listed there. Um, but if you put in a break fee around QOE and legal, what you are, and I understand the concern, right? You're talking about tens of thousands of dollars that, in expenses that you as the buyer will incur. But one, right, you're going to be the only LOI that has that. So, you're going to lose based on that. But two, the signal you're sending there, right, to put that in sends a signal that you're looking for any way out, right? You're looking, you're gonna retrade, right? You're definitely gonna retrade, or you're looking for a way out of the deal, and that's not the sort of signal that you want to be sending. At this early juncture in the process, you need to be building trust and building relationship credits because you might need to use them later.
Yeah, and keep in mind, you just don't know the personality of the seller. Often you haven't met the seller by this point. And if you know, that's one of those points where the seller can have a very adverse emotional reaction, and a deal that otherwise would have been fine just dies on the vine. So you want to avoid those negative triggers. The point of submitting an LOI in some sense is to get to the point where you're meeting with the seller and establishing that relationship.
You referred to inventory and working capital separately, going back now to the inventory, excuse me, the working capital piece of the LOI. So you referred to inventory and working capital separately. Do you split them out in the LOI, or do you bucket inventory under working capital?
Yeah, this is a weird hang up for people. In in a textbook setting, right? Inventory is part of working capital, right? It's just a bucket in working capital. That said, I have multiple purchase agreements that I'm working on right now where inventory is a whole different section, separate and apart from working capital, treated completely differently. Why that is the case is beyond me, but that's how the seller wanted to do it. So be it. In some sense, it really doesn't matter, right? It's just numbers and making sure that all the numbers work together. But in a proper framing, right? Inventory is part of working capital.
Another reason why is because sometimes with inventory, it's less liquid than other forms of working capital. So, like an accounts receivable is probably going to become cash in your pocket in 30 to 60 days. If instead of getting a bunch of accounts receivable, there was actually much less accounts receivable, but it's okay because I gave you a bunch of inventory that probably isn't going to move for a year, that can actually create some liquidity issues for you as the buyer. So I would say in businesses where there's a risk that there's a lot of excess inventory, that's another reason why you don't want to not get your working capital because they gave you, this inventory that has a long sale time instead.
Yeah. And the way that
Yeah.
ultimately gets handled is, right, you build in definitions around obsolete inventory or long, slow moving inventory. But you also you can set, you know, you can set amounts for subcategories of working capital too, right? So it can be, the total target is this, of which at least this is inventory, this is AR, potentially this much is cash. And it depends on the deal structure, but you can break it into its components. You rarely would go to that level of detail in an LOI because you don't know. But in the purchase price, it's fairly common to break it down and have numbers for each.
On another one on networking capital from the bank here. So the questioner says, we heard from Heather Enderson, who does webinars here, that most banks don't like to finance networking capital as a cash injection to the business, but will finance it if it is purchased from the seller. And if they do finance it as a cash, because if they do finance it as a cash injection to the business, it screws with ratios, approvals, etc. I vaguely remember Heather making that point. Do you guys know anything about that?
Yeah, so basically, there might be a temptation to say, okay, we're just going to exclude all the AR, right? Lower the purchase price, but then you're just going to get cash in. And you think, great, right? I would rather have cash than accounts receivable. And so maybe that works. But then to Heather's point, right? Like then you have to get the bank to be on board with that, and they're often not. So that's why, as a practical matter, you are almost always buying your purchase price builds in the assumption that all the accounts receivable are coming with it, and then, um, sometimes if they don't have enough, right, the closing payment is reduced and that amount is funded into the company. But that's more just to deal with like a little bit of the true up stuff. It's not like if you arrive and it turns out like, your working capital target was $500,000 and they say there's only $100,000 of working capital, your bank is going to have a lot of questions. So, yeah.
As I recall, it was also something about banks perceiving like if they, through the loan, are putting a lot of cash on the balance sheet.
Yeah, banks don't like
And
to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, it's all because I think it's almost they feel like they're also funding your deposit in some ways. You're not like,
Yeah,
No,
they
because you're putting the money in and then you're just getting it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
uh,
By the way, everybody, 83 questions. So, and we're bumping up on time here. So we're obviously not going to get to even a tenth of them. So, James David, we know where you'll be spending some time this week. Okay. Um, I've noticed that most brokers ask for an APA directly or first instead of an LOI.
Yeah.
Should we treat these as the same essentially, but with more contingencies, a fleshed out LOI essentially?
no, just send an LOI. I mean, it's not most brokers that do this. There are some, but what I say is just send a normal LOI, a normal process, and you put a real offer in front of them, and you say, broker, convey this to your client.
And remember, at the end of the day, the broker is all about getting paid, right? And so if you are sticking to your guns, but you are the best person to do the deal and you've got the best, you can demonstrate all the things we talked about, then, you're probably going to stand out regardless, or you're not going to stand out regardless. And so I think people get very skittish about how much running and asking for a normal process disqualifies them from the deal process. Whereas in reality, the broker is looking at, are you able to close? And if you're running a normal process and the broker is any kind of market experience, they'll know that you're not at risk of that any more than anybody else would be.
Great. Going to the logic on the LOI, the purchase price, and how and showing the X and Y, the multiple and what that's on the SDE or earnings, what's that's based on, so that when the Q of A comes back and it's lower and you lower your purchase price, your offered purchase price, it's more palatable and immediately there's a rationale to it in the mind of the seller, you hope. What happens if Q of E comes back and it's more?
It's
Um,
very rare.
man,
What I'll say is this, is that I don't think that we have seen a situation. We have seen one situation where the QOE did come back higher. We actually have not seen a situation that I can recall where you have retraded the price up. Not to say that you couldn't. I mean, look, if it's still a great business and it's doing better and the seller really strongly feels like they become compensated for it, I think it's worth having the conversation.
Yeah,
But just, from a practical experience perspective, I don't think that it's very rare.
yeah.
right.
And if it does happen, you don't need to volunteer to have that conversation either, right? Let the seller.
Yeah, you could just say like the QOE came back solid, confirmed everything, and we were happy to move forward. And oftentimes where this actually happens, where you will see some more retrading and stuff, is when there's a significant deviation in the performance over the last couple months, either upwards or downwards. Downwards, obviously, you're setting up for a retrade, but if like they're doing really well, occasionally you'll see sellers that are just like, well, then I should be paid more. And then you're like, I'd have to send it into underwriting again. And, there are things you can do, but
It's more common not that there would be a retrade if there's growth, but that the seller just decides not to sell at all.
yeah.
Mhm.
Or sometimes a seller can be just basically say like, hey, this is a great business. You better just kind of get the deal done and not fight about stuff. And so
Personal guarantees on seller notes.
Not a fan. Um, it's it's a marginal thing. Right? It's a little bit nuanced, but right because the seller note will be subordinate to the bank, but the bank is going to be much more willing to work with you than the seller will, right? The seller is much more likely to foreclose on the note than the bank is, because it's more of just an emotional thing. So for that reason, right, there is marginally more risk for guaranteeing a seller note. All of that said, for purposes of today's conversation, I would never put that in an LOI that I would guarantee a seller note. I do see it sometimes, and I always am confused as to why people volunteer that. But the reality is it's a marginal risk, a marginal additional risk for you. It's not zero, or isn't. But I would never put it in an LOI.
If the LOI offer is significantly lower than the asking price, is it recommended to document the reasons in the LOI? Do you kind of lay out your thinking there?
Some people will do a whole cover page when they send an LOI. That's not a part of our template. I Whatever. I skip over that and just go straight to the numbers, which I think most people do. But there could be a situation where that page is, how you build out your right. Here's why I'm the right person for this business. I'm from this place. We went to the same school. I've been in this industry. Have the cover page. If your valuation is significantly less than the asking price, I probably wouldn't, right? I would probably just state my offer and wouldn't be defensive about it, right? If you're listing, here's the reasons.
you're gonna make them angry.
Well, but it shows weakness too,
Mhm.
right? It's like, no, seller, this is my offer.
Mhm.
Because it's a negotiation, and if you show weakness early, a sophisticated party won't forget it.
Good sage negotiating words to end on. As always, guys, excellent presentation. Any idea what February's is going to be? You want to tease it?
I don't remember. Bill's the one who set the calendar.
Now I'm desperately looking into my email inbox to remember what we told you, what the
Here, I can do the same. Hang tight, everybody.
okay. I should have had that up and ready.
Well, me too here.
I think what we're doing is common legal diligence issues. So basically, kind of thinking of it chronologically, we've done the LOI. Now that you're under LOI, what are the legal issues that come up and how do you resolve them? Or sometimes you can't, but either way.
Another great topic. Great. Well, Bill and James David, thank you as always for a great presentation. Audience, thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention. You'll get the recording in the next, probably this afternoon, if not tomorrow. And then you'll get the LOI template probably in a separate email from Bill and James David in the next 2 or 3 days. Watch for the marketing for next month's webinar that Bill just described, common legal diligence issues and how to address them. We'll start marketing that in a few weeks. And that's it. Any last thoughts, guys?
No. Thank you so much, Will.
Thank you all. This ends the webinar. Bye-bye.